El Alamein in Egypt, the site of two turning point battles during World War II there in North Africa. In the first, the Allied forces stopped the advances of the Axis powers, the Germans led by Rommel in that case. And then in the second battle, they pushed them back. So that kept them from advancing onward to Alexandria and then on up into, quote, the Holy Lands. Two important victories, a turning point of many in the war for the case of the Allies. Winston Churchill would say immediately after the second victory, this is not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. You can hear what he's saying there, that the Germans, the Axis powers, have pushed us to the brink, but we have stopped that beginning. Now we can regroup and move on to greater victory. Years later, he would say this about El Alamein. Before El Alamein, we never had a victory, but after El Alamein, we never had a defeat. It was a turning point in their minds just as much as it was on the battlefield. One of the stories that came out of this came from a man in the British Army who was on the front lines. He was a part of the engineers, and he laid the pipelines that would bring, among other things, fresh water to the Allied troops. So he wrote a book called From Pipeline to Battle. He submitted this little story into Reader's Digest. What happened is that one day during the first battle, they had laid the pipeline on one day. The next day, they were testing the pipeline. But because fresh water was so valuable, they didn't want to waste fresh water. They just used salt water. Well, as they're fighting the battle with the Germans on this day, a group of 1,100 German soldiers just wave the white flag and surrender. And they take them in as captives, and they're all sick as they can be. What had happened was, in the course of their gunfire, they had shot the pipeline. And it began bubbling oil or bubbling water to the surface. And they began to drink the water. And they began to drink the water. And it made them sicker because they were drinking this salt water. So instead of what they thought, dying from this sickness, they surrendered. They were drinking salt water, thinking they were drinking fresh water. They were drinking from the wrong source. So the happenstance of one day making the difference in this German army continuing to advance and them 1,100 of them surrendering happened because they drank more and more salt water. The guy who helped lay the pipeline, Rainier, wrote this little article in for Reader's Digest 1944, and he titled it, "A Drink That Made History." He could tie drinking the wrong source to, in this case, a victory on behalf of the Allies. As we consider this morning the fifth of Jesus' 7 statements on the cross, we could easily say that the drink he takes from that sponge is a drink that made history. We could say that the thirst that precedes that drink is a thirst that changed history. We're studying these events of Jesus and especially his words because we recognize that he glorified the Father. He glorified God in suffering and dying on the cross. And as we prepare ourselves and live for him daily, taking up our own crosses, we cannot but glorify Christ without going to the cross. And that forces us to look at the end of our lives, whether that's in the near future or in the far distant future. And we're not fully prepared to live until we know how we can die. As we think about the various dimensions of Jesus' death, as we've already discussed them leading up to this stage, you can see how each statement represents a different dimension of this experience. He addresses the relational dimension of his death. His mom is not going to have a caretaker. When he says, "Behold your mother, behold your son." He addresses the spiritual dimension of his death, especially as it relates to his enemies, when he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He addresses another spiritual dimension of his death, especially the dimension of a sinner who's penitent, who hangs next to him, when he says to that thief, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." Last week, we recognized how he addresses the emotional dimension of his death. when he cries out in that forsaken loneliness, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's this morning we turn our attention to John chapter 19 as we see Jesus expressing the physical dimension of death. Death for a human being is far more than a physical thing, but make no mistake, it is necessarily a physical thing. In talking about faith and works, of course, James says in chapter 2 of that letter that faith without works is dead, just as the body without the spirit is dead. The spirit leaves the body when life ceases happening in that body. You can't find a body that is lifeless, heart's not beating, brain's not functioning, and yet it contains the spirit or the soul. Likewise, you cannot find a body that is active, that is moving, that is carrying out the signs of life, and yet it is void of the spirit or the soul. They are interconnected, but thus death becomes a very physical thing. Death happens when physical life stops. So what can we learn from Jesus, our Savior, as he endured the physical suffering that happened on the cross? What do we learn from studying and looking into this dimension? Look at John 19, verse 28. After this is the interaction in John's account with Mary and with John. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished or accomplished or completed, he said, then John includes in parentheses, to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there. So they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. What's interesting about this statement is that John is the only one who records these words of Jesus, and yet it's in all four gospel accounts that you find some description of Jesus having this sponge placed to his lips. Listen to how Matthew words it. It's similar in Mark. Matthew 27, verse 47. This comes right after he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Some of the bystanders, verse 47, hearing it said, this man is calling Elijah. And one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. Now, Matthew and Mark don't include him saying, I thirst, but they do include him getting this sponge in the midst of the mocking that comes about whether or not Elijah will save him. It does sound like that when this soldier puts the sponge to his lips, it is a brief moment of relief for Jesus. That it was seen and interpreted by the crowds as an act of kindness and respect. Isn't that amazing? That the crowds wanted him to suffer even more so that they could see whether or not this one Elijah would come to rescue him. It's clear he's suffering the physical aspect of death. Now, what do we notice from him? Number one, notice that Jesus maintains full focus on keeping the very will of God. You notice how John leads into this? After this, Jesus knowing that all was now finished. John comments on Jesus' mental faculties. He doesn't say that it was randomly fulfilled. He says that Jesus was aware of what was happening. That after all of the events leading up to this, and then the 6 hours of hanging there, because this happens at the very end, Jesus was still thinking clearly. How often can we go back to a time when we look at ourselves and we say, well, I was emotionally weak, or I made a poor judgment call, I made an unwise decision, I said something I ought not to have, or I did something I ought not to have done. And then when we try to unpack it, we go back to a physical circumstance influencing us in that negative direction. I was hungry, I was tired, I was in pain for this reason or that. I hadn't taken my medicine. I had taken my medicine, it makes me do some weird things. Can we experience that from time to time? Oh, I messed up in a different realm, an intellectual or emotional realm, but I was influenced on the physical realm. Now track what Jesus is doing. He's going to say he's thirsty, parched unto death even. And yet his mind is clearly focused on keeping the full will of God down to the detail of even this prophecy. That's how strongly focused he was on carrying out all of these prophecies and the very will of God to save mankind. His physical distress was not a hindrance to his supreme focus on carrying out the will of God. It was back in John 4 when he's talking with the disciples right after the interaction with the woman at the well. My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish or to finish or to complete his work. Same language, John 17, that high priestly prayer. I glorified you on earth, having accomplished, having fulfilled, having completed the work that you gave me to do. He has the same mental awareness after hours of the trials, after the punishment, the beatings, the trip to Golgotha, and now the 6 hours on the cross, the 3 hours of darkness, the mocking. He has the same clarity of mind to say, my focus is on seeing the will of God cross the finish line. Knowing that, he says, I thirst. He knows that thirsting and more directly having that thirst fulfilled is an act of fulfilling prophecy. Psalm 22 that we referenced last week, look at verse 16 first. Dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. He's on the cross. Verse 15. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, a fragment of a pot. You take a piece of pottery that would hold liquid or hold something else and it gets broken. Typically, that's what a potsherd is. It's no longer useful. So it just dries up. It dries out. It doesn't contain anything. My tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. This is not the direct prophecy he's probably thinking of, but it still reflects the state he's in. Psalm 69 is even more specific and direct. Verse 19, you know my reproach, my shame, my dishonor, my foes are all known to you. Reproaches have broken my heart so that I'm in despair. I looked for pity, but there was none, for comforters, but I found none. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst, they gave me sour wine to drink. As Jesus hangs on the cross, he knows that people will discuss and will study and will think about what happens on that cross. He knows that it's been planned from time beginning. He knows that it's been prophesied. And he knows that as he hangs there, as these prophecies keep being fulfilled, he's giving those who will believe more and more evidence of how great he is and that indeed he is the Son of God. The power of this prophecy and a few others like it is that it's dependent upon someone else to fulfill it. A skeptic can't look at a prophecy like this one and say, well, he's just kind of stacking the deck and making it look like he fulfilled some prophecies. This was beyond his control. At least in order to be the Son of God, it was beyond his control. It depended on them responding and giving him this drink. And it fulfills that prophecy of Psalm 69. What the takeaway becomes is that Jesus was intimately aware of every detail of the plan of God, the work of God. This is how firm his trust has been in seeing each new layer unfold. We might say, and he would definitely say, everything is falling into place. Everything is going according to plan. How good does it, quote, make us feel when we can say that in our earthly plans? And yet how rarely can we say it? Everything's going to plan. As the plan is coming to an end, he's thinking, everything's coming to an end. Everything's working as it ought to have. That's reflecting his trust in God, his awareness of the plan, and his trust in God to keep fulfilling it. So on the surface, there's no detail in the plan of God that was beyond his care. Every aspect of his suffering, every aspect of this substitutionary death is on Jesus' mind. And when you connect that to what's happening physically, what Jesus is showing for us is the embodiment of the principle he teaches in Matthew 6:33. He has sought first the kingdom of God and God's righteousness. And as such, his physical needs are being taken care of. By saying, I thirst, this Roman soldier shows him a sign of respect or even kindness and gives him a little bit of a drink to ease his thirst. But the second layer, and perhaps for us the most practical from what we can take into our daily lives, is that this is an example and proof of Jesus' exhaustion. He has exhausted himself, as we might say, to quote, every drop of the physical strength that he needed and that he endured as he suffered. You know, if you were to just say about any time in his life prior to this time that Jesus was thirsty, that might not sound all that unique. But it would follow that he must be thirsty. Anything that we experience as a human being, he had to experience, and thus he thirsted. He was tired, so he slept on the boat, Mark 4. He fasted for 40 days, and he was hungry just as we would be hungry after fasting for 40 days. Matthew 4 not only says he fasted, but it says he was hungry. The human responses that we have on the physical plane, he had. He trips, he's going to injure himself. He cuts himself, he's going to hurt, he's going to bleed, just as we would do. The older he gets, perhaps, the more sore he might wake up feeling. He experiences all the natural human responses. So as he goes through this extreme ordeal of crucifixion, he has the expected response that any human being would expect to have in this moment. And so him saying, I thirst, acknowledges his deep connection with humanity as one who took on flesh. Think of how significant hydration and thus dehydration is. It's a dangerous thing to become truly dehydrated. It has massive implications. What's happening on the cellular level, of course, is that all of our millions of cells take the water that's comprising them, and they move all of those water molecules into our blood. And that blood is then funneling all of those water molecules to our organs. They take priority. So that begins to impact our skin and our blood flow. And certain organs have priority over others. And so things like the kidneys begin to shut down first. That's an early sign of our body fighting against itself and our body shutting down, right? When we hear your kidneys have stopped functioning, kidney failure. We lose electrolytes. We sweat. We need potassium and sodium to replace them. And then those who die of dehydration do so because their blood volume begins to shrink. It's like you leave the pot of soup on the eye for too long, and it boils out all the liquid, and the soup almost just burns up in the pot. When that begins to happen with our blood pressure bottoms out, and we can die. So think of what all he's gone through physically. And then he hangs in the same place for 6 straight hours. And during that 6 hours, he's having to breathe in and out. So you can see the recipe for getting incredibly dehydrated. When he says, I thirst, he's not simply saying, I need a drink. He's saying, this is coming to an end. My life is coming to an end. I'm this exhausted. If you've taken care of a loved one, or maybe as a part of your job, you've taken care of those who are dying, you know that one of the final steps is that parched sensation in their mouths. And so there's a whole section of palliative care, hospice care, that addresses how to get the lips and the mouth to be hydrated enough to give a little bit of comfort to the person who is dying. That's where Jesus is. Maybe the most common way that we, without getting close to dying, could experience this is following a surgery. After we've had the tubes down our throats, and it's exposed to the air for all that time, and it's breathing for us, and we finally come to, and they pull all that out, and there's just a parched experience that takes a while to overcome again. So Jesus is experiencing that which any human being would experience, but it is extreme. He's saying, I'm close to death. And his humanity is on full display as he does so. It's important we see that admission by Jesus. I'm suffering as a human being. I'm suffering in the flesh. It's important we see that in contrast to what he did 6 hours prior, which is he refused to take the drink that was offered to him on the front end as a numbing agent. So you go to Mark's account, Mark chapter 15, verse 23, they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. See, it was tradition, it was policy even, that they would have stronger wine mixed with spices. Myrrh would be similar to cinnamon or to nutmeg or to allspice, something like that. They would offer that to these victims because they know how painful it is. So drink this so that you can handle the intense pain and the intense emotions of crucifixion. Here's a strong drink to numb the pain. We see the contrast that Jesus intentionally refuses that drink, the strong drink, before at the very end of the 6 hours, expressing the base need of thirst after long endurance of that pain, of those circumstances. Jesus refused to take a shortcut through the pain. Jesus refused to meet a physical need and a fear of a physical need in an illegitimate way. He did not convince himself, well, I need this. He didn't say, my body needs this. He didn't say, well, the experts offer it. The experts tell me this is easier, so I might ought to listen to the experts. That's often how we talk about substances and how we use them to numb the pains that life brings. What does Jesus do? As he dies for us, he refuses the substance that says, this will help you deal with life. He endures the pain and expresses his humanity and his thirst in simply saying, I thirst. It's become commonplace, certainly more so than at any time in my short lifetime, for Christians to justify and defend substances based on how this helps them get through the difficulties of life. Someone might say, it's been a long day at work, and I just need a beer to cut the edge. Or the kids have been wild because they're not in school all day, and they've been a handful, they've been running around, and we've got family drama, and once they go to bed, a glass of wine would sure help me rest better. You see the connection that our excuses often have? And we can do the same with a number of substances. It's not just alcohol, but that's what's in this text. It can be the same for marijuana as that grows in popularity in a public sense. It could be the same for prescription medication. It could be that a doctor tells us, maybe you should consider this medicine, and yet we improperly connect it to how to deal with the difficulties and the pains of life. Jesus, in facing the most intense pain of his life, or that anyone could face, doesn't take the numbing agent. He doesn't use the excuse. He doesn't say, this will help me get through. It's his trust and his faith in God that gets him through. Proverbs 20, verse 1, wine is a mocker. Strong drink, a brawler, or it's raging. Whoever is led astray by it is not wise. Substances that spark the mind, that ease the nerves, are by their nature deceptive. So when we find ourselves justifying their use, it's clear we've been deceived. And we would do well to take this one step further, to remember that now in our age, it's not just physical substances that pose this threat. We may not partake in alcohol or marijuana or prescription pain medication or tobacco, but we might face, quote, face the difficulties of life by that constant dopamine hit of a screen. I'll get away from this life by looking at the life I live on Facebook, or the life I live on this app or that app, or by getting to my feed in YouTube. We would do well to look at Jesus' contrast here. He refuses to follow the cheap hit, the numbing agent, and instead welcomes and invites the pain and the suffering because it was the plan of God. In the end of the day, nothing, no one that we might use to help us endure can say they've endured the same way Jesus has endured. Jesus endured without that addition of a substance, without that dopamine hit. Thus, he's the only one to whom we can cling for our own endurance. And notice briefly the connection between, quote, point number 1 and now this point. Jesus was able to reject the false promises that numbed the pain because he was so fully focused on carrying out the will of God. What can a substance prove? What can a substance provide when we are fully fulfilled by God and by his work? So that brings us now to seeing why he suffered and how he suffered. It was this willing submission to suffering that caused him to exhaust every drop of strength. He was committed to doing it, and he did it for 6 hours, and he's like, I'm at the bottom of the tank. And he simply says, I thirst. It's this passage in this context that really brings light to a phrase that we still struggle, and a passage we still struggle to fully recognize the depths of. Jesus emptied himself. He took on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. He thirsted when he had been working out in the yard in the heat. But when he goes through these extreme circumstances of the cross, he likewise thirsts to the depths that anyone would thirst in the same situation. This takes on its greatest level of meaning and help for us practically when we see the power that he chooses not to exercise. Last week when he cries out that he's been forsaken, when he cries out in his loneliness, we recognize that the Father did not intervene. He didn't send the angels. He didn't rescue him. And likewise, in this moment, Jesus refuses to create water and intervene to ease his own thirst. He refuses the alcohol of man, but he also refuses to say, I am the one who created water. I will ease my own thirst. He refuses to make water come from a rock as he did for the Israelites during the Exodus. You think about that. They're in the desert, they're wandering, there's no water nearby, and when Moses strikes the first rock, well, when he strikes it again the second time, even though he wasn't supposed to, water comes from a rock. Jesus could have produced water, but instead he simply and humbly says, I thirst. He doesn't intervene. He continues submitting himself to the will of God. And that will was to suffer with us and like us in order to suffer for us. That's the point of Hebrews 2 in making the case for him as our merciful and faithful high priest. Jesus was crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Tasting death, of course, goes way back in the Old Testament with the judgment of God being viewed as tasting this strong drink. Does it take on a little bit different of a nuanced meaning when you think of Jesus saying, I thirst? When you think of Jesus getting this little bit of a drink from a sponge, to think of now the Hebrews writer saying it was necessary that he taste death on behalf of everyone. Same passage a few verses later. We referenced it last week, but we need to reference it again. Since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil. So last week he experienced the throes of loneliness on the emotional plane. But when he says, I thirst, he's partaking in the same things, the physical, parched exhaustion that comes from suffering and death. For this takeaway, verses 17 and 18, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Just think of, again, these connections we've made, how often something going wrong in the physical plane drives some poor decisions in the other planes. Here he is saying, I'm incredibly parched unto death. He focuses on the will of God. He doesn't intervene. He doesn't accept a false promise of numbing. He can look to us and we can look to him and say, whatever it is I'm experiencing, I can endure because he has already endured a greater pain, a greater level of suffering than I can imagine. So just as the will of God was displayed in his mind and he was concerned about every detail, likewise, when he looks and he knows our pain, it always falls within his realm and scope of empathy. There's no pain that we experience that is beyond his empathy. You may struggle. You may have experienced some very difficult pain in life that no one else in the room can say they've experienced it. But you have a Savior who hung there, who was abused, who was humiliated, who thought he was about to die, knew he was about to die. And he gives you that empathy. He now, as your high priest, provides that empathy to the throne of the Father. And it's this substitutionary process that again comes to light when he simply says, I thirst. Because what an ironic twist that the one who created water, who created human beings to need water, the one who miraculously provided water at times, the one who changed the molecules of water at that wedding in Cana for his first miracle, at the end of his life, he says, I thirst. He himself is the living water. Whoever drinks of the water I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I give him will become in him a spring of water, welling up to eternal life. He can give that promise. He can deliver that promise. We can come to him and know that we never have to spiritually thirst again because he intentionally and willingly suffered physically to the point of exhaustion and thirst, far more than we can imagine. He chose to thirst so that we would not have to thirst for eternity away from him. And you could think about, of course, the rich man, Luke chapter 16. How much water did he long for as he was there in torments? It's the fingertip on his tongue. Jesus does not want us to thirst. He offers us living eternal water. Therefore, he endured the thirsting of death and suffering. If you know this morning that you do thirst, you're not fulfilled, you are longing for something that will last, you don't have to stay there. You don't have to leave here on a spiritual plane saying, I thirst, I need more from life. You can leave here with that same eternal water fulfilling you, never getting thirsty again. So if you need to put him on in baptism, choose today to do it. Choose now. If you need to come back to him, to drink once again, to enjoy the peace that comes from forgiveness, let us help you. Let him love you. Would you come as we sing together?